The views, information or opinions expressed during the Journey podcast series are solely those of the individuals involved and does not represent Wise Words Imaging or any other company. Wise Words Imaging is not responsible and does not verify for accuracy. Any of the information contained in the podcast series is available from the respective owner. Enjoy the show.
The 80s was a decade of many things. If you ask wearying leftist bores like me, it was a decade of greed, self-interest, laissez-faire capitalism, and an almost cultish level of individualism. And we're not wrong, obviously. But there were other aspects. In particular, it was a decade that charity became all but industrialised, as a reaction to the overwhelming air of callousness. It's kind of surprising how late ITV came to the party, but they went all in when they did. Apart from one issue, which happened to be the most important issue. The cause. Telethons, as a format, are surprisingly old and unsurprisingly American. The very first was way back in 1949, hosted by Milton Berle and in benefit of the Damon Runyon Cancer Foundation. The word telethon was independently coined by various newspapers the day after. It proved successful and novel enough that there was a minor flurry in the early 50s, starting with the very first United Cerebral Palsy telethon barely a year later, which soon became an annual fixture.
Yes, folks, this is your old hillbilly cousin, Mississippi Mac.
The format was having the piss taken out of it as early as 1955, and it became easier still 10 years after, when Jerry Lewis began nearly 50 years of increasingly mawkish and patronising muscular dystrophy fundraisers.
It's been a love day. It's been a good day. A good day for mankind. As saccharine as it may sound, as corny as it may be, my God, what a good day for mankind.
Which eventually died of embarrassment shortly before Lewis did. By contrast, over here in Britain, such flashiness was considered highly vulgar. The BBC Children in Need charity is as old as the corporation itself, but the telethon we know and occasionally pay the slightest amount of attention to today has barely 40 years on the clock. Initially it took the form of 5-minute appeals on Christmas Day, which weren't even televised until Sooty took the job on in 1955. It was another 25 years before the BBC gave in and decided to turn it into an all-night affair. And even then it took another 5 years to become the single shiny floored variety show, The Template. ITV, however, beat them to the punch altogether. More specifically, Thames Television produced the very first telethon in British history on the 2nd of October 1980, albeit only in London, for disabled and disadvantaged children around the capital. Footage of the 1980 Thames Telethon is damn hard to find, which may be connected with the fact that it was co-hosted by now disgraced dead bastard Rolf Harris alongside AIDS denialist Joan Shenton. This is a show where Jimmy Young was the least objectionable presenter, so perhaps I shouldn't be altogether surprised that the only video I can find of it is this interaction between the bastard and Metal Mickey. There's also a few behind-the-scenes snaps, and an appalled write-up from Clive James in The Observer the next day. Doubtless the handicapped children benefited materially from the abundant funds raised overnight by the telethon on Thames, but one wonders if even they thought it was worth the spiritual cost. Here was a sample of what the Americanization of television will do to our collective consciousness if we let it happen. There are less painful ways of committing national suicide. But Clive's warnings went unheeded. The telethon had arrived in Britain and it wasn't going anywhere. Children in Need got steadily more involved each year from a mere linking device until it finally embraced the modern world in 1985 with the introduction of Pudsey Bear in a single one-night show. That same year had already seen the largest charity event in the history of the world, a very specific response to a very specific world event, which made charity itself into a kind of conceptual megastar. That October saw the second Thames Telethon, almost as Live Aid backwash. This one was, at least in theory, Britain's first ongoing 24-hour broadcast, from 7:30pm to 7:30pm on October the 29th and 30th, in the company of Andrew Gardner and Sarah Kennedy, with a yawning gap halfway through, of course, because 6 to 9:25 were TVAM's hours. Presumably, the people in the Euston studios just carried on performing to absolutely no one for 3.5 hours at the break of dawn. Possibly not. Thames Telethon 1985 raised £1.25 million, which was a genuinely impressive total for an appeal shown solely in a single region, even if it was the capital. A follow-up seemed inevitable, both for charitable and televisual reasons. The high-concept, high-publicity idea of a 24-hour telethon continued to tickle the brains of ITV's movers, shakers and basters. At that time, ITV was the first and only channel to run continuously through the night, and this made them the only channel capable of a 24-hour television marathon. It was a unique selling point that only they could provide. But if it wasn't to have a credibility gap like the Thames Telethon, it was going to have to involve at least 2 franchises. Better yet, the whole network. A massive undertaking like this only being broadcast in one region of the country was a good way to make a loss, charity or no charity. Besides, once National Breakfast was involved, everyone would want to be. No way around it. If there was to be a follow-up, it had to be national. And there was. When the year ended with the launch on the BBC of Comic Relief, all bets were off. The BBC now had 2 charity affiliations. ITV were more determined than ever to get some of that action. And they had the resources to do it bigger, better and louder. It was practically their duty. The Thames Telethon provided the blueprint. A studio variety show with sad VT pieces about whatever it was they were raising money for. Occasional breaks for the news and related programming, and opt-out visits around the regions. In Thames's case it had been sub-regions, of course, but ITV expanded it to include the entire network, with frequent 50-minute opt-outs for the franchisees to do their thing. Of course, there were complications. TVAM graciously chipped in so their hours were covered, and they scheduled it over bank holiday anyway, so Good Morning Britain wouldn't be affected. There was also the issue of one region, London, being represented by 2 companies, but that was sorted out similarly by scheduling it at a weekend. LWT handled the main studio programme, and Thames did the London opt-outs. To host for an unprecedented 27 hours, with power naps, LWT chose Michael Aspel, a walking definition of the term safe pair of hands. While this massive undertaking was gestating, the bar was being raised. Shortly after the second Thames Telethon, Children in Need reached its final form of a single 6 to 8 hour broadcast with heavy branding and, more importantly, a symbol and mascot in the shape of Pudsey Bear. He would soon become inescapable every November and help the charity to raise increasingly insane amounts every year. At the same time, Comic Relief was coming together in response to the same ongoing humanitarian crisis that had sparked Band and Live Aid. It too understood the importance of image and branding. It started off Secret Policeman's Ball style with a single charity concert in 1986, but the bar had been raised well beyond that by then. Band-Aid imitators, either in the forms of charity concerts or as increasingly unlistenable fundraising singles, were springing up for everything you could possibly imagine and more. Please forgive me. So Curtis, Henry, Tewson and Bennett Jones took the Children in Need template and centred Comic Relief around a single day of fundraising, culminating in a marathon broadcast that came across like a sort of alternative comedy take on the usual Children in Need all-nighter. To ITV's frustration, the original night of comic relief that ended the very first Red Nose Day was the 5th of February 1988, short of 4 months before ITV were about to go live with their own, and barely a fortnight after they'd announced it was happening. So close to being ready, and these comedy bastards come along and steal the thunder away. But never mind, the ITV Telethon, a no frills title, was going to be more impressive anyway.
Frank Carson, 4 times television with no fee, disappearing.
This is Anglia. It's 10 seconds to Telethon.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ladies and gentlemen, your host for the next 27 hours, Michael Aspel.
This was going to run for an unprecedented Aspel-draining 27 hours nationwide, from 7 on Sunday to 10 on Bank Holiday Monday, taking in all manner of fun and or games, including some sort of snookathon with the game's biggest stars, Eddie the Eagle visiting Disney World, special episodes of Blind Date, Search for a Star, and various other ITV game shows, and oddly enough the bland sitcom All in Good Faith, special performances from Cannon & Ball, Sue Pollard and the Spitting Image Puppets, not all at the same time, personal appearances from Prince Charles and the Stephen Fry, dressed for some reason like Freddy Krueger, and end-of-the-pier horrors such as a bodybuilding contest hosted by Judy Spires, fortunately scheduled for the dead of night, as was a Tiswas reunion, presumably to be on the safe side. They even got some corporate sponsorship courtesy of Bisto Gravy Granules. The entire morning from 6 a.m. to noon was children's programming, hosted by Gaz Top and Andrew O'Connor. There was music from Lulu, Gloria Gaynor and Sunita. There was a special Coronation Street segment, in which Doris Speeds visited the set 5 years after her departure from the role of Annie Walker. There were stunts involving Orion Airways and Presto Supermarkets, and the usual downright stupid bits involving sponsored idiots sitting in porridge, or having a pillow fight, or abseiling down Clydesdale Tower while dressed as King Kong, or just making stupid faces for 10 pence. Most of these were seen in the regional opt-outs, which could also produce images bordering on the outright surreal.
Now time for music as we join 3 Line Whip, 3 liberal and talented members of Parliament.
A 2, a 3, a 4.
If you were in London, you had the misfortune of the opt-outs being fronted by actively hateful comic Jim Davidson, which is ironic given his refusal 15 years later to play to an audience with a wheelchair-using front row. It was exactly as billed, a huge, nightmarishly drawn-out edition of Children in Need with slightly lesser personalities and occasional, merciful commercial breaks. But it was all in a good cause, right? Sure it was. Just live and let live, that's what I say. No one's forcing you to watch. Now I'm raising money for... Wait, what are they raising money for?
Hello, it's me. And I want to invite you to spend a great weekend in front of your television set, that is, just where you are now. Because Sunday evening will be the start of the ITV Telethon. 27 hours packed full of amazing entertainment and fundraising events designed to help out wherever help is needed across the country. Please don't miss it, because there's not going to be another weekend quite like it.
The Telethon 88 was heavily hyped, as you might expect for such a massive undertaking. ITV wanted a return on their investment in ratings terms, if nothing else. But amidst all the puffery and build-up, one subject that didn't come up much was the cause. Oh, there was plenty of talk about caring and compassion and giving, but for and to whom? Children in Need were upfront about it. It's right there in the name. Comic Relief were formed as a specific response to the First World's repeated failing of the Third. What was the point of the ITV telethon? To what urgent need was it responding, other than for ITV to have its own children in need? It was really more of a desire. Well, it was vague. There was a definite sense that they'd rather you just didn't ask. Advertising and marketing claimed the cause was just sort of whoever needed it. Like Tom Joad, wherever help was needed, the telethon would be there. One of the event's slogan motifs pretty much summed it up. Turn on to it. Get into it. Give to it. It was supposed to be a vague pun on ITV, of course, but it made a useful symbol for the empty heart of the enterprise. This was charity for its own sake, at best. That wasn't going to be enough in practice, however. They were going to have to be specific, at least in the VTs, that, as is the norm with this sort of thing, interrupted the Butlins in Hell fun about once an hour. So they went from the notion that this was an outgrowth of the Thames Telethon, which in itself had basically appropriated Capital Radio's premise, Save a London Child. So the cause was scaled up accordingly. Help save the country's children, and disadvantaged and downtrodden in general. There were sad kids in hospital beds, smiling kids with visible chromosomal disorders, freezing old folk, the occasional social issues such as solvent abuse, and especially sad kids whose legs or arms didn't work properly, into whose faces the camera was particularly fond of zooming so you could practically see the sad little pores in their sad little skin. All the better to see those faces light up when they're presented with gifts from the generous and warm-hearted normal people of Britain. Here's the thing. Things are far from perfect for disabled people here in Space Year 2023, but put it this way, at least their basic status as autonomous human beings is acknowledged these days.
Both James and Mrs. Fox are handicapped. And like all disabled people, they need special help with their particular problems. So if you're disabled or you know anyone who is, then this leaflet is for you. It tells you about all the allowances and benefits which are available, as well as the medical and social services provided. You may need special aids, for example, or you may need to learn how to carry out everyday tasks again. It also tells you where you can get further assistance and advice. Whether your handicap is mental or physical, permanent or only temporary, this leaflet can help you and your family. So it's called Help for Handicapped People.
Take wheelchair ramps. You see them all the time, right? Take them for granted. Well, you do if you're able-bodied, anyway. Well, in 1988, far from being a legal requirement, they were a rarely seen treat, outside of subways and the like. Many wheelchair users were unable to go to the theatre or cinema or almost anywhere, really, because in the absence of such things, they were considered fire risks. Or rather, the chairs were, rather than the people sitting in them, but what was the difference? As for recourse to the law, you could forget it. There was no law against discrimination on the basis of disability of any kind. Or take council housing, which is none too clever today, but back then, the whole idea of people having physical disabilities simply didn't occur to them. Now, I know this one for a fact because my childhood home was a semi-detached on a hill set several feet below the road outside, which you have to access via not one but two sets of steps. And this is despite my fact that my father is disabled. Hemorrhagic epiphyseal dysplasia, if you must know, look it up. And could really have done without the extra struggle to get in and out of his own damn house every day. And obviously that's a relatively mild example, but even if he had been in an actual wheelchair, the dead-eyed idiots would probably still have given us that house because they just didn't think. Or care to think. The point is that this was a world made for and by able-bodied people. And the disabled, we still used the term handicapped in those days, were aberrations. Broken or unformed people who just had to fit in as best they could with us normals. And if they couldn't, then at least be quiet about it. Not that we superior ones were without compassion, of course. The telethon demonstrated that as celebrities turned up to shake their heads at these sad and apparently quite helpless people, occasionally providing presents for them on behalf of the normals for being so brave. The sound of disabled people around the nation grinding their teeth as one was almost palpable for the entire 27 hours. ITV, however, apparently didn't notice. At least not yet. The mammoth broadcast raised over £21 million. An unqualified success. Another one was inevitable. It was too big and unwieldy to be an annual thing, however, so the second go-round was scheduled for 1990, again over the second Maybank holiday. A few things had changed at ITV at the interim, mostly as a direct or indirect result of the Broadcasting Act. The franchisees were all busy fighting for their contracts, for one thing, leading to less bonhomie around the network, but a slicker and more streamlined update to the logo. So that was nice.
You're watching TVS.
10, 9, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Your host for the next 27 hours, Michael Aspel.
ITV also took note of developments in televised charity, with the first 2 Red Nose Days now behind them. Telethon may have raised cash, but it didn't have much of an identity of its own. Its sole sell-through gimmick, outside of the usual t-shirts and baseball caps, was a little blue gong they called the Telethon Bug, which didn't do an awful lot of business. Comic Relief had raised millions before their telethon even started, as well as providing a genius central image for the whole endeavour. A big red nose that anyone could buy and wear, if they didn't mind looking like a twat. What Telethon needed was their own red nose. So for Telethon 90 they introduced blue ears. It couldn't have been more obviously an extrapolation by a particularly unimaginative ad man, and they were barely seen anywhere except on ITV itself, usually being worn by continuity announcers and the like under protest. They also needed a pudsey, but that they already had, as the aforementioned Telethon Bug, of which there were plenty of unsold gonks from 1988, stepped up to the plate, gaining a cartoon face, various adorable animations, and most importantly ubiquity all over the event itself, right from the title sequence. That little bastard was everywhere for the whole 27 hours. There was even a tie-in single, since Comic Relief had done so well with Living Doll and Help. Telethon's equivalent was something called Power to the Pupils, which apparently consisted of a medley of several school-related songs, Another Brick in the Wall, Baggy Trousers, rather tastelessly I Don't Like Mondays, all performed by the Stage 1 theatre group. I'm not making any of this up. I have no idea what it sounded like. It didn't chart for crap and cannot be found anywhere today, and that is almost certainly for the best. The content of the telethon itself was highly similar. There were musical skits with newsreaders and the cast of London's Burning. There was a hot air balloon rally. There was Spitting Image and Blind Date and a one-off quiz with Chris Tarrant. There was even another special Coronation Street thing with a returning character, Hilda Ogden this time. They even repeated Judy Spires judging oiled-up hunks in Plymouth. And of course, there were the appeals, which by all accounts were more patronising than ever. I say by all accounts because it's hard to find footage of them. There's plenty of footage of the fun and games to be found on YouTube, but surprisingly little of the appeal VTs, almost as if there's some kind of shame attached to them. What I have seen lives down to its reputation, all right. The disabled and underprivileged are thoroughly othered, set apart from the rest of the human race with no apparent hope of ever being a part of it. Broken people with pieces missing who could never be like us normals, through no fault of their own. It was practically our duty to help the poor things. The disabled weren't the sole or even necessarily the main beneficiaries of the ITV Telethon, the object of which, lest we forget, was vaguely to raise money for charities close to home, but they were the most photogenic, in a very specific sense, especially the ones whose disabilities were visible, or could be made visible. Heartstrings needed to be pulled in order to raise the cash and justify the whole endeavour, and the most efficient way to do that was to point at disabled people and go, "Aww." Actual disabled people, who are obviously just people like everyone else, if at a slight disadvantage, got angrier and angrier. What they needed, and still need, was for the world to just treat them the way everyone else is treated, since fundamentally the only difference is that they're sitting down or whatever. What they were getting was classification, not even implied but often outright stated in many cases, as separate, a subspecies, subhuman even. I don't want to single out the ITV Telethon as the only source of disability discrimination. Children in need and comic relief could be none too clever about it themselves for one thing, but really it was basically everywhere. There was just no respect for the disabled, and even those able-bodied people who did care rarely, if ever, made an effort to push beyond basic pity. There's a reason the main disability affairs magazine on Radio 4 was called Does He Take Sugar? But the ITV Telethon took this open wound and nonchalantly poured in the salt, simply out of having no other reason for being. During Telethon 90, the LWT studios were picketed by several dozen enraged people sick of pity. It was noticed, but it was also relatively small. And meanwhile, Telethon 90 raised even more than the first, over 24 million. They couldn't stop now. After two massive events that went off perfectly, mostly,
at HTV Wales in Cardiff. Well, we can see some pretty pictures, but I expect they're speaking in Welsh, that's why they didn't tell us. Anyway, later.
The ITV Telethon was on the brink of becoming an institution. Okay, so the blue ears hadn't caught on, but there was no ignoring that fuzzy bastard. Telethon 92 was inevitable.
Gentlemen, your host for the next 28 hours, Michael Aspel.
It even gained an hour, bringing it up to 1 1/3 of a day. It was also the edgiest of the three by far, and I don't mean in the Jordan Peterson sense of the word. For one thing, ITV's world was very different once again in 1992. 4 of the participating companies had lost their franchises. By the time of broadcast, in mid-July this time, they had only 5 months to live. Most of them glumly pasted on smiles and got on with it. But TVAM's sole contribution was a paltry hour of cartoons fronted by Michael Aspel. Meanwhile, it was moved up to a Saturday and Sunday, one suspects because the outgoing Thames no longer felt like sharing what little airtime they had left. No blue ears this time, but there was another official single, Supertramp with Give a Little Bit, on the basis that they were re-releasing it to promote their greatest hits, and it had a vaguely appropriate title, so ITV hopped on back of it. It didn't chart, but it came closer than the last time. More urgently, the controversy reached boiling point in the build-up. The block telethon protests had gone quite nicely in 1990, considering how few resources they'd had to get people together. Since they hadn't stopped it from happening then, as soon as Telethon 92 was announced, the blowback returned as well. This time, bigger than ever. ITV had been stung by the criticism, of course. There is a definite defensiveness about Telethon 92. The VTs are a little more tactful and thoughtful, and there are some attempts at acknowledging disabled people's basic equal personhood with the able-bodied. These are courtesy of Martin Lucas, a producer at Thames who was hired specifically to provide a disabled viewpoint, both within the programme, Lucas is a wheelchair user, and for the viewers at home. Despite being a collaborator, he was broadly on Block Telethon's side, except that he preferred to work within the system, painfully aware that Telethon was one of the few places disabled people got any TV exposure whatsoever, even if they were doing it about as completely wrong as was humanly possible. In an interview at the time, he said, "I see it as a great opportunity to slip the knife in, to be subversive. If we can work within it to change the way people view us, then that's all to the good. It is only then that we will start to be included on TV in other ways." Top marks for idealism, but the damage had already been done. This time for the London opt-outs, Thames, keen to look like they cared, hired then up-and-coming Mick Scarlett, who readily agreed, to his lasting regret. According to him, he at that time had no idea of the controversy, or of disability politics in general, and participating in Telethon 92 turned out to be a harsh introduction to the subject. After being confronted on the streets, accused of treason, and even physically assaulted at times, he ended up thoroughly radicalised, not to say repentant. Most of the edginess was right there on screen, especially during the first hour. Even right at the start, Michael Aspel, consummate professional though he is, has the air of someone who knows full well that there are over 1,000 enraged people on the other side of this building, bellowing that he shouldn't be there, and getting closer all the time, until the bubble finally burst just under half an hour in.
All sorts of things. I'm going to be digging for eggs with a JCB. You've got to come and see this. Yeah. Mining for eggs. And there'll be people stepping to the moon. Heavens. And there'll be all sorts of things. There'll be Atlantic 252 who are going to be there. Oh dear, we've got some cross people.
People outside this building opposing this programme.
Right, I'll tell you what. We will now see the reason we are doing this programme. Here's another film. Thank you.
She's got a way. Jane has been to see the consultant at the Sheffield Children's Hospital.
They were soon shuffled off again while the heartwarming VT played out, but they and many others could still be heard on occasion for several minutes afterwards, leading to a bit where they cut to Cilla Black in a blind panic.
Up and running. Now, throughout Telethon, we shall have some special editions of your favourite programmes. In fact, right now, in a nearby studio, someone waits with news of one of those shows.
Yes, Michael, we're ready, willing and raring to go here on Blind Date. Hey, I tell you what, though, it's been all go all here today. I don't know whether I'm on foot or horseback. Anyway, we're ready when you are, Michael.
Thank you, Cilla. It won't be long now. In fact, in just a minute. But first, let me introduce you to Derek Wanless, who is the Group Chief Executive of NatWest.
Followed by an excruciatingly nervy faux casual chit-chat with the head of NatWest, where all attempts at humour or even realistic bonhomie are swallowed up by sheer anxiety.
Well, we're more than happy, so thank you very much indeed. There's a rather handsome-looking chap on the poster you've got, I believe, isn't there?
That's right, you've seen the right ones. It's John Alderton.
Yes. Well, it's not what I was thinking of, but it doesn't matter. All that matters, of course, is that your volunteers are bombarded with calls over the next 20-odd hours. 28 hours. They're ready and waiting, enthusiastic. We want to keep them busy. Well, thank you very much indeed to Derek Wanless, who is Group Chief Executive of NatWest, and to all the thousands of NatWest staff glued to the Telethon phones.
Even the audience couldn't figure out whether to clap. Though things eventually settled down to the usual rubbish, it was clear this couldn't go on. If they'd done another telethon, it could have been all-out war, and that wouldn't have been a good look. More to the point, Telethon 92 raised a relatively mere 15 million, down by almost 10 on the last time, and 6 on even the first. The protesters actively discouraging people from donating won't have helped, but there were other factors. There was a recession on, for one thing. Besides, a decade of charity was over. Everyone was rather sick of being told to give their money. Especially for something like Telethon, where it wasn't terribly clear where it was going, and there was very little on screen to justify it. At least Comic Relief was funny, then, and Children in Need only a single evening instead of 28 punishing hours. Telethon was officially more trouble than it was worth. By 1992, no one even seemed to be enjoying themselves anymore. Even if there had been a Telethon 94, and if it hadn't been for the protesters, there probably would, it's hard to see it limping along to 1996, especially with the ITV network well into the process of devouring itself by then. ITV have done some telethons with a small t since then. There was a Day of Promise in 2000, which was confusing and pointless and instantly forgotten. And most notably Text Santa, a through December campaign that culminated in what was basically a Christmassy Children in Need. That ran from 2011 to 2015, before being killed off practically at the height of its success on the basis that there was enough Christmas already, thank you. Apart from that, ITV have been content to allow the BBC to own the format of the shiny flawed charity all-nighter in the form of Children in Need, Comic Relief, and now Sport Relief too, all of whose big shows are more or less indistinguishable these days. Sport Relief has a bit more emphasis on physical activity, I suppose. What those three have in common are specific charitable aims that people can identify. The main thing that the ITV telethon was missing. And that was because it wasn't actually created with charity in mind, but television. Children in Need, Comic Relief, Live Aid, all of those were born of human emotional responses to situations. The ITV telethon was born of a desire to have a telethon. Today it's the ultimate example of charity without sincerity, of the concept of caring used as a commodity, or even a gimmick, in the pursuit of ratings and kudos. Its main benefit was in accidentally giving rise to the Disability Action Network, whose story you can see in the exemplary BBC TV film Then Barbara Met Alan on iPlayer and Netflix, which I urge you to look up. What it was all literally in aid of was an afterthought, never particularly clear, and ultimately reduced to the patronisation of disabled people almost by default, because they made for the best VTs. Which naturally stirred up enough anger to eventually kill it. It's not just the road to hell that's paved with good intentions. The one the telethon laid started nowhere and ended nowhere. The last word belongs to Clive James, desperately and vainly trying to prevent all this in the wake of the 1980 Thames telethon. The only certain beneficiaries of a telethon are the corporations who secure cheap advertising time by putting up prizes or making tax-deductible donations. The audience gets little to enjoy beyond the unintentional humour generated by technical cock-ups. As for the handicapped children, they gain some of the means of life. But life in what kind of world? To do what? To watch Bernie Winters host a darts competition? There has to be another way.